Excellent. Thank you so much. So we are presenting the 5 principles for inclusive teaching and learning. And next slide, please. This is based on the guide for inclusive teaching at Columbia University. You have the QR code here, and we will actually drop the link in the chat as well. So our guide is available on our website and is a way for us to share with you the 5 principles as well as strategies that are evidence-based and learner-centered. And so we're going to walk through the 5 strategies today as well as share with you some of the practical strategies. We've also interwoven some voices from our students' perspectives into these conversations. So we are going to jump right into the next slide, please. So the 5 principles, this is going to be a little bit of clicking through to each of these principles. So we're just going to share a brief overview here. So first off, 1, establish and support a climate that supports and fosters belonging for all students. Next, we have set expectations for our students. So this is being very explicit with what we expect of our learners. Thirdly, we have select course content that recognizes diversity and acknowledges barriers. Next up, we have design all course content for accessibility and all elements of our courses. And then finally, we have reflect on one's belief about teaching to maximize self-awareness and commitment to inclusion. So we're going to dive a little bit more deeply into each of these principles. So starting off with principle 1, next slide, please. This is all about community and belonging and how we build rapport and our classroom environment, the climate of our classrooms. Next slide, please. In speaking with some of our students, and here we have a quote from Haya, it became very clear that for them it's all about feeling seen and being heard in the classroom. And Haya is one of our students as pedagogical partners and spoke very eloquently about what inclusive teaching means to her as well as what it means to her peers, and shared her perspectives in some of our on-demand resources, and we'll share links to those in a moment. So next slide, please. One question that we have for you today is how do you create a learning community in which all of your students feel a sense of belonging? So we'd invite you in the chat to please share your perspectives. We'd be really curious to hear what kinds of strategies you are currently using in your courses. Next slide, please. Continuing on with some of our student voices, our student Michelle Yao told us that it's the little things that really matter and make a difference when it comes to how she feels engaged in her courses. So everything from having informal conversations with her professors before class or after class or during office hours, as well as the importance of just having the professor use their name properly as well as their pronouns. And so this definitely made a big difference. Next slide, please. A couple of strategies that we highlight in the Guide for Inclusive Teaching. Number 1, getting to know our students. So early in a term, this could be everything from having a brief informal survey that we send out to our students to ask them some information that might be relevant to our courses, or asking that our students meet with us individually one-on-one during office hours. We also want to cultivate the rapport that students have with each other. So this would be done through icebreaker activities, and we have a QR code here to Building Classroom Community resource that is available on our website and goes into some of the examples that might work well for any teaching context or teaching modality. And then finally, checking in and collecting feedback from our students. So engaging in dialogue, giving them space to be able to express themselves and to check in, doing a temperature check to see how things are going. Next slide, please. So principle 2 is all about communication and sharing our expectations and being really transparent with our students. And so here it is really up to us as instructors to communicate what we expect of our students as well as what they can expect of us. Next slide, please. When we think about principle 2, we have a tendency to think a lot about the community agreements and the ways in which we establish the relationships. So going a lot along the lines of principle 1. However, here we're also thinking about the ways in which we bring students into this work. And so here, one of our student partners, Irvin talked to us a lot about how it's ongoing work, and to engage in this work together with instructors is really critical. So for instance, establishing discussion guidelines, whether for in class, in person, or for the online discussion forums that she engaged in. Next slide, please. A couple of strategies that we oftentimes emphasize is around establishing community agreements, ideally writing these with our students or co-constructing them with our students, making clear how our students will be assessed, so sharing some criteria, perhaps a rubric, so that our students can do some self-assessment as well as know exactly why we've given the type of feedback that we've given. Speaking of feedback, providing timely feedback and feedback throughout an entire term is really critical so students can kind of track their progress and know how they're doing. And finally, how instructors actually model particular behaviors that they'd like to see in the classroom context. We have a QR code here that goes to our resources and guides page, which has a lot of resources, including those around discussion guidelines, rubrics, timely feedback, and things like that. So encourage you to check those out. And I'm going to pass things off to Amanda, who's going to take us into the next couple of principles. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If we could go to the next slide, which should be principle 3. So principle 3 is all about content, selecting course content that recognizes diversity and acknowledges barriers to inclusion. So in the discussion of this principle, we encourage instructors to meaningfully consider the role that content plays in creating a learning environment where students see themselves as reflected and valued. If you could move to the next slide. We see one of our students as pedagogical partners, some of the undergraduate student consultants we work with in our center, thinking about how important it is that we help students see themselves reflected in a course. This is all about the instructor meaningfully considering the role that content plays in creating a learning environment where students see themselves reflected and valued. And some sort of lighter lift strategies are included in the next slide. Thank you. So here we talk about partnering with students. Of course, it's ultimately the instructor's responsibility to make sure that there is a diverse representation of content in the course, but we can also, of course, see our students as viable sources of information, agents in their own education, and encourage them to make connections to course content, share examples that might diversify perspectives in the classroom, and then, of course, bring in content that engages a diversity of ideas and perspectives, perhaps even content that occupies positions of opposition to the content that might have initially been included. If we could go on to the next slide. So principle 4 is all about designing course elements for accessibility. So we loved the presentation right before this. We are huge proponents of accessible course materials, all course elements at the Columbia CTL. So principle 4 asks instructors to recognize the diversity of learners' abilities and experience and provide multiple ways for them to engage in course materials and express their learning. So what does this look like? It could be providing flexibility or choice in assignments, modes of course engagement, but it's also about providing students with resources to both the course, the institution, and each other. If we could go to the next slide. We'll see again one of our undergraduate students talking about how accessibility centers for her in terms of inclusive teaching and inclusivity, that there are multiple ways that students can access and complete assignments and multiple opportunities to demonstrate their learning. And again, this is also another opportunity to partner with students depending on the course level and the level of the student to come up with options for demonstrating learning in a particular discipline. So some strategies, if we could go to the next slide, please. Options for how students engage, options for how students demonstrate their learning, but sharing resources beyond the ones that, depending on the learning needs of your students, sharing resources that enable them or empower them to access course content or access each other as resources. And then, of course, access to the instructor, making ourselves available as we work with students so that if there is any opportunity for differentiated instruction, that we're able to step in there. There is a resource on the next slide that we'd love to share with you. We are big fans of practical, thank you, Suzanna, for putting that in the chat. So there's a QR code link here, but then also you'll see every time there's a QR code link, we're dropping the link into the chat so you can easily get to it. We're big fans of practical application. It's how we came to develop the guide in the first place. And so this is a tool that we've developed in coordination with colleagues in the States, and you'll see references to those included in the document, but designing an inclusive syllabus. So you'll see strategies about reimagining syllabus elements for inclusivity and reflecting your commitment to inclusive teaching in your syllabi. Next slide, please. So principle 5 is our concluding principle, and it is all about reflection and self-awareness. And so we are working towards an opportunity in principle 5 for instructors to interrogate their own biases, interrogate their own assumptions, interrogate the way they approach learning and teaching, and how that, quite rightly, influences the way they engage with their students, the way they prepare course materials. We, as instructors, don't check ourselves or our lives at the door any more than students do. And so we really like to center Principle 5 on reflection and self-awareness and a commitment to inclusion, the individual level of the instructor. And of course, we acknowledge that there are other more institution-wide efforts that might be happening, but in terms of designing an inclusive course, the instructor plays obviously a primary role. Next slide, please. So we have some questions that you might reflect on: your assumptions about students, your course designs, your syllabi, your course materials, your assignments or your assessments. And so how might you make your courses more inclusive? The next slide, if we could go there, offers some additional resources or opportunities. So we have our CTL's podcast, Dead Ideas in Teaching and Learning. It's an exploration of ideas in higher education that no longer serve us, but for some reason they keep sticking around. And so we hosted the authors of What Inclusive Instructors Do for a discussion of dead ideas in teaching and learning, particularly around inclusion, diversity, equity, and justice in the higher ed classroom. It's a fantastic conversation. Highly recommend you check it out. And I believe that Suzanna has linked in the chat for us. We're almost done. I promised. Go to the next slide, please. So when we started today's webinar, there was a conversation about, inclusion online, but we're also, a lot of us, back in a face-to-face environment. So our guide, which is a distillation of all of the relevant research around inclusion and diversity, or if not all, then most, to help lower the barrier to entry. These same principles in this online resource are translated to what it means to enact these principles in a fully online environment. We recognize that this is not the entirety of the conversation, but we hope that it is a good entry point. And you'll see we've included student voices as well as actionable strategies for each of the principles in an online environment. The original guide focuses on the face-to-face classroom. We've had really interesting conversations about what it means to do high flex or hybrid instruction and how we can harness the best of both worlds. And finally, next slide, please. We like to partner with our learners when we think about all things teaching and learning. They're a giant stakeholder in that equation. And so we have some resources that our students who partner with us in our CTL have created. Learners' perspectives on remote teaching and learning, learners' perspectives on experiences with inclusive teaching and learning online. These students are extraordinarily eloquent and really empowered to talk about their presence in a classroom, so highly recommend you check it out. And then final slide, please. Questions. So this is my contact information. I'm Amanda. Suzanna's contact information is listed here, and we might have time for a few questions, but I will defer to our leader, Phil Anthony, whether we stayed to time.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have gone a little bit over. I'm so sorry. I hate to do this, but in order to keep the time for the last presentation, we will have to move on. But I would like to say thank you so much. You've shared so many fantastic resources with us there. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to share those with the community via the mailing list, just so people can really access these fantastic resources that you've created. So yeah, well done. I think what you've done is fantastic, and thank you for taking the time to be here with us today.